Jonah Merrick dragged a 9-foot cotton sack down a Mississippi row in the September heat. The land under his boots was his. The deed was folded in the coat he'd left hanging in a sharecropper's shed, and not one soul on that field knew it. The overseer never looked at his face. He looked at his hands. Slow hands, he called them. Soft hands. He watched them the way a man watches a tool he means to throw away. At the scale that evening, Ransom Cobb thumbed the beam. He called the weight 40 pounds light. He said it loud, in front of 30 croppers with their hats in their fists. A soft-handed Yankee's worth half a field hand, he said. Take it or walk. Nobody argued. Arguing cost you the commissary. Arguing cost you the meal your children ate that winter. So they looked at their feet, and they let it pass, the way they'd let 100 things pass before. That same evening, a barefoot girl pressed a folded scrap of paper into Jonah's fist. She ran before he could speak. He didn't open it under the porch lamp. He waited until the cabins went dark and the whole place was breathing slow in its sleep. Then he read what she'd written. And what a 12-year-old had put down in pencil was a thing no grown man on that land had dared say out loud. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who should have looked closer, this story is for you. Before we go on, do this one small thing. Subscribe and leave a comment telling me the town you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now settle in. Let me take you back to the fall of 1934, to a place called Caldwell's Crossing, and to the day a rich man rode down to walk his own dirt as the lowest hand on it. The letter came to St. Louis on a Tuesday, in an envelope thick as a hymnal. Jonah Merrick read it at his desk with a cup of coffee going cold at his elbow. He was a grain broker. Wheat and corn mostly, numbers were the water he swam in. He could look at a column of figures the way other men looked at a woman's face, and he could tell you in a breath whether it was honest or whether it was lying to him. The letter was lying to him. He could feel it before he could prove it. It came from a lawyer named Silas Pruitt down in the Delta. It concerned an estate called Willow Bend, near a town Jonah had never seen. The estate had belonged to an uncle, Ezra Merrick. Jonah had met the man exactly twice, both times as a boy, and remembered mostly a pair of enormous hands and a smell of pipe smoke and pecan hulls. Ezra had died in the spring. He'd left no children. He'd left the land, all of it, to the one nephew he'd apparently decided was worth leaving it to. And the land was bleeding. $6,400. That was the figure. A loss of $6,400 across 2 seasons. The cotton was in the ground and the cotton was coming out of the ground. But somehow the money went in and did not come back, and the bank down there wanted the whole thing sold to cover its paper. Pruitt laid it out plain. Sign here. Let it go. Wash your hands of a place you've never lived and take what little the sale leaves you. Jonah read the figure 4 times. $6,400. In a Delta cotton season. In the 3rd year of a depression that had cotton crawling along at 10 cents a pound. That was not a small hole. That was a wound. And the thing that bothered him, the thing that kept his thumb pressing on the corner of the page, was that the letter explained everything except the one thing that mattered. It told him the money was gone. It never once told him where. A bookkeeping problem, he thought. Some tired manager letting the columns rot. A little theft, maybe, the kind that creeps into any place the owner never visits. He'd seen it a dozen times in a dozen grain outfits. You send a man down, he squares the books, you sell clean or you don't sell at all. That's what he told himself it was. A bookkeeping problem. He was wrong, and it would take him 3 weeks in the dirt to learn how wrong. He could have sent a man. He had men he could have sent. Instead, he did a thing that surprised even his own wife when he told her. He packed a canvas grip with 2 changes of plain clothes, a razor and his uncle's old pocket watch, and he took the train south, and then a mule cart the last stretch, and he rode into Caldwell's Crossing looking like exactly what he intended to look like. A man down on his luck, drifting for work, willing to bend his back for whatever a plantation would pay. He gave them his first name, just Jonah. He said he'd come down from up north looking for anything with wages on it. He did not say Merrick. He did not say St. Louis. He did not say that the tin-roofed commissary and the long white rows and the sagging gin shed all belonged. On a paper folded in his coat, to him. "I want to see where it goes," he'd said to himself on the train, watching the country flatten out into cotton. "Before I sign a single thing away, I want to stand in it and see with my own eyes where the money bleeds." He thought that was caution. It was. But it was also the most reckless thing he had ever done, and he did not yet understand that either. Willow Bend spread out under a white sky. The rows ran to the tree line and past it. The cotton was open, the bolls busted white, and the pickers were already strung out along the rows in the early light, sacks trailing behind them like the tails of slow animals. Jonah stood at the edge of it with his grip in his hand and let the size of it settle on him. His uncle had built this. His uncle's name was on the gin. And he, the man who owned every inch of it now, could not have told you the first thing about how a season actually ran. That ignorance was going to be his education. The overseer found him before noon. Ransom Cobb was a big man gone slightly to seed, maybe 50, with a red neck and pale close-set eyes and a way of standing that took up more room than his body did. He ran the scale, he ran the commissary. He ran, so far as Jonah could tell in that first hour, the entire living and dying of the place, and he ran it with the easy confidence of a man who has never once been checked. He looked Jonah over the way you'd look over a mule at auction. "You picked before?" Cobb said. "Some," Jonah lied. Cobb reached out and took Jonah's hand and turned it over, palm up, uninvited. He ran his thumb across it. The palm was smooth. It was the palm of a man who'd spent 20 years pushing a pen, not a hoe, and there was no hiding it. Cobb laughed. It was not a kind sound. "Soft as a churchwoman's," he said. He turned to a couple of hands passing with sacks and held Jonah's hand up like a fish he'd caught. "Look here. Yankee come all the way down to Mississippi to learn what work is." He dropped the hand. "I'll give you a sack. I'll give you half a hand's pay till them hands crack open and bleed and turn to something. Half, you don't like it, the road's right where you left it." "I'll take it," Jonah said. "Course you will," said Cobb, and turned away, already bored. That was the first thing Jonah learned, standing there with his rejected hand at his side. Not the theft. Not yet. Just this. That on his own land, a man had looked at him and decided in 4 seconds exactly how little he was worth. It was a small thing. It would not stay small. But he filed it away where he filed everything, in the quiet ledger he kept behind his eyes, and he picked up the sack, and he went to the rows. The work near killed him the first 3 days. He would not pretend otherwise, even to himself. The sack dragged. The bolls tore his fingers. The sun sat on the back of his neck like a hand pressing him into the dirt. By the second evening, his soft palms had split exactly the way Cobb promised, and he wrapped them in rag and picked anyway. Because a man drifting for wages doesn't quit on the second day, and because some hard, stubborn thing in him refused to give Cobb the pleasure. But a man who counts for a living cannot turn his counting off, and so even bent double and bleeding, Jonah watched. He watched the way you watch, when watching is the only thing you're any good at yet. He learned the place cabin by cabin. The Turners were nearest the shed where they'd let him sleep. Amos Turner was maybe 38, a lean, straight-backed man with a cropper's patience and a cropper's tiredness both worn into his face at once. He worked a plot of shares out past the second creek, 40 acres he'd been trying to make square with the estate for longer than he liked to say. He was honest. You could tell it in a day. He was also, Jonah came to understand slowly, drowning, held under by a debt at the commissary that never got smaller no matter how much cotton the man dragged to the scale. And there was the girl. Etta Turner was 12, and she was the sharpest thing on that whole plantation, and nobody but Jonah seemed to have noticed. She sat on the commissary steps in the evenings while the grown folks settled their credit, and she watched, and she said nothing, and behind her still face something was always working. Jonah caught it the first time he saw her lips move over a column of figures on the commissary board, figures the clerk read out fast, meaning for nobody to follow, and she followed them. All of them. Faster than the clerk read them. She caught him catching her. Her eyes went flat and careful, the way a child's eyes go when they've learned that being noticed is mostly dangerous. He looked away first. But he'd seen it. She could cipher, better than the men, maybe better than Cobb. The machine took him about a week to understand, because the machine was built to be hard to understand. It worked like this. Every family picked. Every evening they dragged their sacks to the scale by the gin, and Cobb hung each sack on the beam and thumbed the weight and called out a number, and a tally man wrote the number down in a book. That number was the whole world. That number was what a family had earned that day, the sum of a dozen back-breaking hours. And it was set entirely by one man's thumb on one beam, and there was no second scale to check it against, and no cropper on earth who dared ask for one. Jonah watched Cobb's thumb for 4 evenings before he was sure. Then he was sure. The beam read light. Every load. Not by a wild amount, Cobb was too smart for that. 30 pounds, 40-50 on a big sack where the loss would hide in the bulk. A cropper who'd killed himself all day for 200 pounds got called in at 150, 160, and had no way in the world to prove different. Because who argues with the scale? The scale is the scale. The scale doesn't have a side. Except this one did, and its side was Ransom Cobb. And the shorted weight didn't vanish. That was the part that made Jonah's counter's heart go cold. The cotton was real. It went to the gin, it got baled, it got sold in Memphis at whatever cotton was fetching. The full weight got sold. But only the light weight got written into the book the croppers were paid against. The difference, 30 pounds here, 40 there. Across 200 souls across a whole season, the difference went somewhere else, into some other set of figures. And Jonah would have bet his own name, the name he wasn't using, that those other figures were exactly the $6,400 that the letter in St. Louis had called a loss. It wasn't a loss. Nothing had been lost. It had been taken, in 30-pound bites, off the backs of the people picking it, and then it had been dressed up in a ledger to look like the land itself was failing. He needed to be careful now. He knew that. A drifter who understood too much too fast was a drifter who ended up dead in a ditch with the sheriff calling it a drowning. So he kept his face slow and his mouth shut and his split hands wrapped, and he let them all go on thinking the Yankee was soft in the head as well as soft in the palm. He almost gave himself away over the tally. It was the second week. The tally man took sick, a fever going around the cabins, and Cobb, short a set of hands at the gin, jerked his chin at Jonah. "You Yankee, you can make a mark, can't you? Come write these down. And don't foul it up or it comes out your half pay." So Jonah stood at the book while Cobb called the weights, and the trouble was that Jonah could not make himself slow enough. Cobb would call 3 numbers in a row, and Jonah would have the running sum before the third one landed, sitting there in his head clean and finished, and once, just once, he opened his mouth to say the total before he caught himself, and what came out was the total. Sharp and instant and exactly right, a column of a dozen loads added faster than any tallyman alive could have done it. The gin went quiet for half a second. Cobb turned and looked at him. Really looked, for the first time since the day he'd checked his palm. Something moved behind those pale, close-set eyes. Not understanding. Not yet. Just a snag. A splinter of wrongness. A field hand who couldn't pick was one thing. A field hand who added a dozen figures in his head like a bank clerk was another thing entirely, and it did not fit the box Cobb had put him in. Jonah fixed it the only way he could. He made himself stupid. He knocked the inkpot with his elbow and near spilled it and fumbled the pen and said, Sorry, sir, I lost my place. I'll start it over. And he counted the next column slow and wrong on purpose, ticking each load off on his fingers like a schoolboy, and let Cobb sneer and take back over. Give it here, Cobb said, disgusted. Reading figures don't make you worth feeding. He shoved Jonah back toward the door. But he watched him go. Jonah felt it on his back the whole way out. He'd been careless. He would not be careless again. But the splinter was in now, and splinters like that don't come out on their own. It was that same night he heard about the box. He was sitting with two other hands near the shed, sharing the last of a plug of tobacco, saying little. When one of them, an older man, half in his cups on cane liquor, got to talking about Cobb the way men talk about a boss when they're sure he can't hear them. Man keeps two of everything, the old hand said. You know that? 2 books. One he shows, one he keeps. Real ones stay in that iron box in the office, under the floorboard behind the counter. I seen it once when he had it open. He spat. Don't matter though, ain't nobody ever gonna open it but him. The owner's up north somewhere. Rich man. Never come down here once in his life, near as anybody knows. Never looked at them books and never will. He laughed, a wet unhappy laugh. Cobb runs it like his own. Because far as this land's concerned, he is. Jonah kept his face still and his eyes on the dark. An iron box. Under the floor. The real books kept where the man who owned them would never think to look. Because the man who owned them lived 1,000 miles away and had never once come down to check. The owner never checks. That was the whole engine of it, laid out in a drunk old man's mouth. The entire scheme rested on one single load-bearing fact, that the man whose name was on the deed did not exist here, would never appear here, was as good as a ghost. Cobb had built his whole kingdom on the certainty of an absence. And the absence was, at that very moment, sitting 6 feet away in the dark, sharing his tobacco, listening to every word. Jonah did not smile. It would have been a mistake to smile. But something settled in him then, quiet and heavy and permanent, like a stone dropping to the floor of a still pond. He had come down looking for a bookkeeping problem. He had found something with teeth. And he understood, finally, that he could not simply square the columns and ride home. There were faces attached to this money. There was Amos Turner's straight, tired back and Etta Turner's careful, flat eyes and 30 men who took their hats off to be robbed at a scale. Whatever he did now, he did it for them, or he did nothing, and doing nothing was no longer a thing he could live inside. He almost gave himself away a second time, 3 days later, and this time it was worse. They had him digging out a stump near the old creek, the second creek, the one that curled behind the Turner plot. He was working alongside Amos, the two of them taking turns on the mattock, and to make talk past the labor, Jonah said, without thinking, that the creek water tasted of iron, same as a creek he knew of once. And Amos said this creek didn't have a name that anybody used. Sure it does, Jonah said, wiping his face. Panther Branch. Least that's what the old man called it. And those pecans up along the rise, he nodded at a stand of trees, gnarled and heavy, those are grafted. Somebody grafted those on old rootstock, years back. You don't get pecans like that wild. He heard himself say it half a second too late. Panther Branch. The grafted pecans. Things his uncle had told him, on one of those 2 boyhood visits, a big pipe-smelling man walking a little boy along a creek and pointing out the trees he'd worked with his own hands. Things nobody would know unless they'd known Ezra Merrick. Things a drifting Yankee down for the picking season had no earthly business knowing. Amos had stopped digging. He was looking at Jonah with a new expression, quiet and startled and turning something over. How you know all that? Amos said. It wasn't quite a question. Panther Branch. Old man Ezra's been dead since spring. You never met him. You said you just come down. He straightened up slow. You kin to him? You Merrick people? For one long second the whole thing balanced on a knife. Heard it in town, Jonah said. He made his voice flat and closed the door on it. Fella at the store was talking. Old names stick with me. He picked the mattock back up. That stump ain't gonna dig itself. Your swing or mine? Amos looked at him a moment longer. Then he let it go, but not all the way. Jonah could see he'd filed it, the same way Jonah filed things, in some careful place behind the eyes. It sat between them the rest of the afternoon, unspoken. Jonah had been reckless twice now. The tally at the gin. The creek. Each time the disguise had slipped a half-inch and he'd yanked it back. But the slips were adding up, and slips add up faster than a man thinks. Then came the weigh-in, and the day everything he'd been quietly watching stood up in front of 30 men and could not be watched quietly anymore. It was late September, the big weigh, when a season's carrying got reckoned against a season's picking, and a family found out at last whether they'd cleared $1 or gone deeper under. The whole place came in for it. 30-some families, hats in hands, children hushed and holding to skirts, the light going gold and long across the gin yard. Cobb stood at the scale like a preacher at a pulpit, the tally book open, the commissary clerk beside him with the credit ledger. This was the altar of the whole place. This was where the year got decided. Amos Turner brought his last loads up. Jonah stood back in the crowd with the other hands and watched Amos's face as Cobb hung the sacks and thumbed the beam. He watched Cobb call the weights light, a little light, always a little light, the practiced skimming thumb. And he watched the tally man write down the skimmed numbers. Then he watched the clerk open the credit ledger and start reading off against those numbers the whole freight of the year. Meal bought on credit. Coal, seed, doctor for the fever that had gone through the cabins. Each line at a commissary price that was a little too high, the way the scale was a little too light, the same thumb on a different beam. And when the clerk was done reading and the two columns met, Amos Turner's whole season came out to almost nothing. Worse than nothing. He'd picked cotton from can't see to can't see for a year, and the book said he still owed. Carried over, the clerk said. Same as last year. We'll carry it to next. Amos stood very still. He did not argue. You did not argue. But Jonah saw the man's hands, and the hands were shaking, and something in Jonah that had held quiet for 2 weeks came loose. Read the beam again, Jonah said. It came out of him level and clear, and it carried across the whole yard, and every head turned. Cobb looked up slow. What'd you say, Yankee, that last sack? Jonah stepped forward, out of the crowd, into the gold light. You called it 160. I watched the beam settle. It read 204. He said the numbers plain, the way you'd say a true thing that needed no dressing. You're 40-odd pounds light on it. Same as you were light on the 2 before it. The yard had gone dead silent. Even the children felt it. For a moment Cobb just stared at him, and Jonah watched the man do the arithmetic behind his own eyes. Not the cotton, the danger. A field hand had just called him a thief at his own scale in front of every soul he ruled. If it stood, if any of it stood, the whole beautiful machine cracked. And Cobb had built the machine, and he knew exactly how to defend it. Because he'd been defending it for years. He laughed. He made it big and easy and contemptuous, and he aimed it at the crowd. Well now, he said, the Yankee can read a scale. He walked around the beam toward Jonah, taking his time. The soft-handed Yankee who can't pick 100 pound in a day is going to teach me my own scale. That the way of it? He turned to the croppers, spreading his arms, playing to them, and Jonah understood he was being made into a lesson. You all hear this? Man comes down from up north, can't crack a bowl, splits his little hands open, and now he's the authority on Delta cotton. He came in close. His voice dropped, but not so low the front rows couldn't catch it. I told you the first day. A soft-handed Yankee's worth half a field hand. And now I find he's worth less, because a field hand knows to keep his mouth shut. He reached over to the tally book and made a mark, hard, and said it loud so it would land on every ear. Dock him 40 pound off his own week for the trouble, Cobb said. There's your arithmetic. And any man wants to stand up here and side with him, the commissary's got a long memory. He let that hang. He looked around the yard slow, and one by one the hats dipped and the eyes went down. Because every family there had a credit line and a winter coming, and Cobb held both. "Didn't think so," he said. Then he said the thing that would hang him. He said it easy, out of pure swagger, a man so sure of the ground under him he'd say anything. "You want to appeal my scale?" Cobb said to Jonah, grinning, playing the last card of a winning hand. "Take it to the owner. Go on, write him a letter up north. Only trouble is, he tapped the beam with one thick finger. The owner don't check the scale. Never has. Never will. Far as that beam's concerned, I'm the only owner it's ever had." Jonah said nothing. That was the hardest thing he had done in 2 weeks, harder than the sack, harder than the split hands. He stood there in his field clothes with 40 pounds docked off him and a whole yard watching him be humbled, and he had in his coat hanging in a shed a quarter-mile off a folded piece of paper that would have turned Ransom Cobb's face the color of ash. And he said nothing. He let it stand. He let Cobb win the evening. Because winning the evening would cost Cobb the year, and Jonah could count, and the arithmetic of that was the only arithmetic that mattered now. He looked at Amos Turner instead. Amos was looking back at him with something raw and grateful and frightened all at once. And past Amos, on the commissary steps, sat the girl, Etta, and she was not looking at Cobb at all. She was looking at Jonah. And her careful flat eyes were not flat anymore. They were wide open and burning, and they were doing arithmetic of their own. He worked the rows the rest of that week like nothing had happened. That was the discipline of it. He let the docked pay stand. He let Cobb feel like the master of the yard. And in the small hours and the edges of the day, he did the other work. The quiet work that costs nothing and buys everything. He split his water ration with the Turner children when the day was hot. He carried a sack of meal to Amos's cabin one evening and set it inside the door and said it was extra. Said the commissary had shorted him a sack in his favor for once, and he had no use for the second. Which was a lie, and both men knew it was a lie, and neither one said so. He expected nothing back. That was the point. He was banking something, and it was not gratitude he could spend. It was trust. And on a plantation where every kindness had a price tag, and every price tag was a trap, a man who gave and asked for nothing was a thing the croppers had almost forgotten could exist. Etta watched all of it. He'd catch her at it, on the steps, in the rows, at the edge of the firelight. Watching him tally in the dirt with a stick when he thought no one saw, because he had started keeping his own count, scratched in the dirt and rubbed out, of what the scale said versus what the scale should have said. Watching him be gentle with her little brothers. Watching him take Cobb's contempt without flinching and give it back nothing. She was putting something together. She was smarter than the men, and she'd had longer to watch. And she had a child's terrible clear eyes that saw exactly what the grown-up eyes had trained themselves not to. And near the end of that week, in the blue dusk between the rows, she made up her mind. She came at him quick and sideways, the way a barn cat comes, here and gone. She didn't speak. She pressed a folded scrap of paper hard into his hand, closed his fingers over it with her own 2 small hands. And then she was gone, running low between the cotton with her bare feet silent on the dirt, before he could get out a single word. He stood there with it in his fist. He did not open it in the open. He carried it back to the shed and waited, the way he'd waited over everything, until the last lamp in the last cabin died and the whole of Willow Bend lay breathing in the dark. Then he lit the stub of a candle, and he sat on the edge of the cot, and he unfolded a 12-year-old girl's piece of paper. It was written in pencil. In a careful, cramped hand, the letters formed slow and sure by someone who'd taught herself to read off a commissary board because no one had ever taught her any other way. And it was all there. She had written the light scale. She had written how the beam read 30, 40, 50 pounds under, and how the gin sold the full weight and paid the short. She had written the commissary prices too high, keeping her father carried over and carried over so the debt could never square. She'd even laid out the two books, that Cobb kept a true set and a false set, and that the true set lived in the iron box. And then she had written the thing. The thing no grown man on that land had said out loud, not the drunk old hand, not her own father, not anybody. She had written what she'd overheard, or pieced together, or simply understood the way she understood everything faster than the grown folks did. That Cobb meant to burn them. That on settlement night, when the last books were closed for the year, he was going to put the true ledgers in the stove and burn every figure, so that no season could ever be proven. So that no man could ever come back later and say, here is what you took, and here is what you owe me. Burn the arithmetic itself. Leave nothing but his word and the ash. Jonah read it 3 times by the guttering candle. A child had done it. A child had sat on the commissary steps year after year, with her careful flat eyes, and worked out the whole machine. A scheme that grown men had suffered under and never dared name, and then because a strange soft-handed Yankee had read a beam out loud and taken a docking for it without flinching, she had decided he was the one safe grown up in her whole world to hand the truth to. She had done the thing her father was too crushed to do, and the old hands were too frightened to do, and Jonah himself, the owner of it all, had needed 2 weeks and a lucky drunk to piece together. She'd had it the whole time. He folded the note back along its creases, slow and careful, the way you'd fold something you meant to keep for the rest of your life. He did not yet know he'd carry it for years. He only knew, sitting there in the dark with the candle throwing his shadow big against the shed wall, that everything had changed. He'd come down thinking it was ink on a page. It was a man's stove, and a settlement night, and a fire waiting to eat the proof of every stolen season before anyone with the power to stop it ever laid eyes on it. And he had that power. It was folded in his coat. It was the deed to every board and beam and cotton row of Willow Bend, and it named Jonah Merrick. And not one soul on this land knew the man in the shed, and the name on the paper were the same. He blew out the candle. There was, he understood now, a clock running. Settlement night. The fire. He didn't have all the time in the world to be careful. He had until the last book closed, and then the truth went up the chimney and Ransom Cobb's word became the only law the Delta had ever known here. Somewhere between now and that night, he was going to have to stop watching. He was going to have to move. And when he moved, the disguise that had kept him alive for 2 weeks would be gone for good, and there'd be no yanking it back. He lay down in the dark with the note in his shirt against his chest, and he stared up at the tin roof, and he began, quietly, methodically, the way he did everything, to count what he'd need. He would need the true books, not just to know they existed, but to have them. He would need to see, with his own eyes, the false set the bank had been shown against the real set in the iron box, to hold the two side by side and prove the $6,400 wasn't a loss at all, but a road. A road that ran straight from 30-some picking families into one overseer's pocket. He would need it before the fire. And he would need, when the moment came, more than his own word against Cobb's, because he had learned exactly what one man's word was worth on that scale. Outside, far off, a dog barked once and went quiet. The cotton stood pale and still under the stars, acres of it. All of it his, none of it knowing. 2 days later, Cobb sent him to sweep out the office. It was nothing. It was a chore handed to the lowest hand because the lowest hand was fit for nothing better. Cobb tossed him the key and told him to clear the cobwebs and the mouse dirt and not to touch a thing that mattered, and then Cobb rode off toward the gin, sure as sunrise that a soft-handed Yankee alone in a room could do him no harm at all. Jonah stood in the empty office with a broom in his hand and his heart going slow and hard. Behind the counter, under a floorboard. He'd been told exactly where. He set the broom against the wall, and he knelt down, and he began to feel along the boards for the one that would lift. The board lifted easier than he'd feared. It came up with a soft groan of old nails, and under it, set down into the dark between the joists, sat the iron box. He didn't reach for it right away. He knelt there and looked at it. It was a plain thing. Black iron, a hasp, no lock hung on it because Cobb had never once believed a lock was needed. Why would he? The owner up north had never come. The croppers couldn't read. And the lowest hand on the place was a soft-handed Yankee cent to sweep out the mouse dirt. Jonah lifted it out and set it on the counter. Inside were 2 books. He knew before he opened them which was which. The top one was clean, careful, the numbers standing in neat blue rows. That was the book for the bank. That was the $6,400 loss written out fair and sorrowful. A plantation just scraping by, the owner well served to sell and be shut of it. The book underneath was different. It was worn at the corners. The figures crowded close, written fast, written by a man who never meant another soul to see them. And there it all was. Every family down the left, every season across the top, and 2 numbers for every load, what the cotton truly weighed and what Cobb wrote it at. Turner. Amos Turner. Jonah ran his finger down the line and felt his jaw go tight. 204 pounds, the true weight. 160, what Cobb had called it. 44 pounds gone, that load alone. And below it another, and below that another. 2 seasons of them, load on load, every one shaded 30, 40, 50 pounds light. And at the bottom of the column, the thing that turned Jonah's stomach cold, the carried-over debt. The number that never went down no matter how much cotton the man dragged out of the ground. It only climbed. Because the commissary meal was priced to make it climb. And the light scale made sure it could never be paid. The $6,400 wasn't a loss. It was a road. It ran straight out of 30-some cabins and into one iron box. Jonah stood there a long moment with his uncle's plantation open in his 2 hands. Then he heard the horse. Far off, but coming. Cobb, back early from the gin. Jonah moved without hurry, because hurry was how a man dropped things, and he put the 2 books back the way they'd lain, top and bottom. And he set the box down into the dark between the joists, and he laid the board over it, and he pressed the nails home with the heel of his hand. He picked up the broom. He was sweeping the far corner, slow and dull, when Cobb's shadow filled the door. Get it done? Getting there. Cobb looked at him a while. Jonah didn't look back. He kept the broom moving, kept his face empty, kept his soft hands loose on the handle like they'd never held anything heavier than a pen. Reckon you did, Cobb said. And he took the key back. That night Jonah lay in the shed and he did not sleep. He had it now, all of it, in his head and in that box 30 feet away under a board. But knowing wasn't proof, and proof under a board Cobb could burn in one night. The girl's note said it plain. Settlement night, the ledgers go in the fire. After that there'd be no true weight left anywhere in the world but in Jonah's own memory. And one man's memory was worth exactly what his word had been worth on that scale. 40 pounds light. Nothing. So he'd need his own book. Not to threaten, not to wave. Just to hold, quiet, load by load, until the day he could set it down beside Cobb's own hand and let the 2 of them agree. He started the next morning before the sun was full up. He had a stub of pencil the girl had likely dropped for him on purpose, and he had the inside cover of a seed catalog, and he had a place at the edge of the crowd where a man could see the beam if he cared to. Nobody cared to. That was the whole trick of it. Cobb read a family's cotton, thumbed the beam down a hair, and called a number. And 30 tired people took the number because the number was all they'd ever gotten. But Jonah watched the beam before the thumb. He read the true poundage off the notch, quick, the way he read a grain contract, and he set it down small in the catalog margin. True weight. Called weight. The gap between. Family by family. Dawn by dawn. He never spoke a word of it. That was the part that would have surprised anybody who thought they knew him. He'd been cheated in front of 30 people. He'd been called half a field hand and told to take it or walk. And he took it, and he said nothing, and every morning he set another theft down in the margin of a seed catalog and folded it away against his chest next to the girl's note. The days went by like that. The cotton came in. The gin ran. And the whole time, Jonah walked those rows knowing what no one around him knew, that the drifter they pitied owned the ground under their feet, and the man they feared was a thief on borrowed time. He shared what he had. It cost him, and he did it anyway. When the Turners' meal ran low, he split his own sack and carried it to their door and wouldn't hear a word about paying it back. When the sun laid a man out in the middle rows, Jonah gave up his water and worked dry the rest of the day. He expected nothing for it. That was why it worked. The croppers had been taught by long practice that a kindness always had a hook in it. And here was a man whose kindness had no hook. And slow, the way trust always comes slow to people who've been burned, they began to look at him different. Etta looked at him different from the start. She'd catch him at the dirt with a stick, working a column of figures in the dust the way another man might whittle. She'd stand at the commissary steps with a book she wasn't supposed to have, and she'd watch his hands. She never said much. But her eyes said she'd added a few sums of her own about the drifting Yankee, and they hadn't come out to a drifter. It was Cobb who nearly ruined it. There came an evening, maybe 5 days on, when the shortfall didn't sit right in Cobb's own crooked books. Somebody was watching the beam. Somebody had done arithmetic Cobb hadn't authorized. He couldn't have said how he knew. He only knew the air had changed. The way a man who lives by cheating can always feel another man's eyes on his hands. He stood on the scale platform that evening, and he looked out over the tired faces, and he said, loud, "Somebody in this yard's been carrying tales." Nobody moved. Somebody's been running his mouth to the wrong ears. And when I find out who, he let it hang. His eyes went down the line. And they stopped, the way Jonah had feared they'd stop, on Amos Turner. Because Amos was the one who'd been robbed the hardest. Amos was the one with the most cause. And Amos had a girl who could read. And everybody knew it. And a girl who could read was a danger in a place built on nobody being able to. "Turner," Cobb said, "you got something you want to say to me?" Amos took his hat off. That was the awful thing. A grown man, robbed of 2 years' work, took his hat off to the man who robbed him. "No, sir," he said. "Nothing, sir. Your girl. She reads." "She?" Amos's throat worked. "She don't know nothing, Mr. Cobb. She's a child." And that was the moment it could all have come apart. Right there, with a scared father and a cruel man and a child 3 steps away on the commissary stairs. So Jonah did the only thing left to do. He made himself the fool. "That'd be my fault, Mr. Cobb," he said. And every head turned. Because the lowest hand had spoken up uninvited twice now and lived through it once. Cobb's eyes came around slow. "Your fault." "I've been asking questions," Jonah said, and he put a little wine in it. A little Yankee softness, a man too green to know he was in danger. Back home a hand knows what the cotton runs a pound, knows his own tally. Down here nobody'd tell me straight, so I've been pestering folks. If somebody's ears got tired of me, that's on me, not Turner. I'm just trying to learn the work. He watched Cobb weigh it. He watched the man decide that a nosy fool was a smaller thing than a plotting cropper, and easier dealt with besides. The suspicion slid off Amos like water off oilcloth. It slid onto Jonah instead, which was exactly where Jonah could carry it and Amos couldn't. "You want to learn the work," Cobb said. "Then learn to shut your mouth. That's the first lesson and the last one. You hear?" "Yes, sir." Cobb stepped down off the platform, and the evening went on. Amos put his hat back on his head. And when Jonah passed near the commissary steps in the dusk, Etta looked at him. And there was something in the child's face that was almost too much to look at. Because she understood what he'd just done, and she understood why, and she was 12 years old and carrying it. It was that same week the watch slipped. Jonah had it on him always, his Uncle Ezra's old watch, a heavy thing on a worn chain, tucked deep in his shirt where a drifter had no business keeping such a piece. He'd bend to lift a sack, and he'd feel it swing against his ribs, and he'd press it back. But there came a morning at the scale, reaching up to steady a load, when it swung out full into the light, gold on its chain, turning slow. He caught it fast and pushed it away. But not fast enough. Etta had seen. She was on the steps with her book, and her eyes had gone to the gold and then to his face, and she'd read the two together the way she read everything. Quick and sure and quiet. A hand didn't own a watch like that. A hand who owned a watch like that wasn't a hand. She didn't say a word. She looked down at her book. But that evening she was waiting where the path bent toward the shed, half in the weeds, and she said, "Lo, that watch. It's old. It is. It's got letters on the back." I saw. E and M. Jonah crouched down so his eyes were level with hers. The cotton stood pale behind them in the last light. "You don't miss much," he said. "E.M.," she said. "That's not your name. Your name's Jonah." "It's my name," he agreed. She looked at him a long time, the way children do when they've worked a thing out and are giving the grown-up one last chance to lie about it. He didn't lie. He didn't tell her the truth either. He just held her look and let her keep what she'd figured, and after a while she nodded once, slow, like they'd shaken hands on something. "Settlement Saturday," she said. "He's going to burn it Saturday." "I know. You're going to be gone by Saturday," she said, and her voice cracked on it. Because a child's certainty is a fragile thing and hers was breaking. "He's going to run you off and then there won't be anybody who, Etta." He said it gentle. "Go home, keep reading your book, and whatever happens Saturday, you did the bravest thing anybody on this place has done in 2 years. You remember I said that." She went. But she looked back twice. The girl had it right. Cobb was already moving. The suspicion Jonah had taken onto himself had not gone away. It had settled. A man who cheats for a living learns to cut a loss before it grows, and Cobb had decided the reading Yankee was a loss. 2 nights later, Cobb walked the office in the dark and found the window unlatched, a thing Jonah had done days back and forgotten to see to. And it lit the whole thing up in Cobb's mind. Somebody had been in the office. Somebody had been at the box. He didn't know it was Jonah. He couldn't prove it. But he doubled the lock on the office door the next morning, a second hasp, a heavy padlock, and he was seen carrying the iron box out and back like a man who'd started sleeping with his money. And he set the burning firm. Settlement Saturday. The last loads weighed light, the season closed, the bank's clean book squared, and that night the true book into the stove where no year could ever be proved again. Then he came for Jonah. It was Thursday evening. Cobb found him at the shed and he didn't waste words. "You're done here," he said. "Draw your pay Saturday morning at the scale like everybody. And then you're off Willow Bend by noon. I don't want to see your face on this land past Saturday." Jonah kept his voice flat. "I've done the work." "You've done more than the work," Cobb said. "You've done arithmetic. And I don't keep hands that cipher." He stepped in close. "You think I don't know what you are? You're trouble in a straw hat. Well, hear this. You make one sound Saturday, one, and it won't be you that pays, it'll be Turner. His girl'll be off that plot and out on the road before the sun's down, him and all his brood, and you'll have done it. So you draw your pay, and you keep that soft mouth shut, and you walk. You understand me?" "I understand you," Jonah said. And he did. He understood that Cobb had just, without knowing it, told him the shape of the whole ending. Saturday, the scale. Every family gathered. The book's still in the box, not yet burned. The lawyer's wire he'd sent a week back from Caldwell's Crossing would have reached St. Louis and the county seat by now. All of it was going to happen in one place, on one morning, in front of everyone. Cobb thought he'd set a trap. He'd set a stage. Jonah lay awake most of that last night, not from fear, from the old habit of counting, of making sure the columns squared before he closed the book. The deed was in his coat. The watch was against his ribs. The girl's note was folded to his chest, soft now from handling. His own weight book, load by stolen load, was folded with it. He went over the order of it in the dark the way he'd go over a contract. Cipher first, then kin, then the deed. Let it come in 3, so a man had time to feel each one land. Outside the cotton stood still. The last of it. His Saturday came up clear and cold. They gathered at the scale the way they always had, 30-some families, more, because settlement drew everyone. The year's whole labor came down to the numbers Cobb called from that platform, and a family lived or went hungry by them. Wagons in the yard. Children underfoot. The gin quiet, for once. And Cobb up on the platform in his good coat, the tally book open, the beam swinging empty, ready to close out 2 years of theft and go home and light a fire. He worked down the list, family by family, and it went the way it always went. A man dragged his season up onto the scale, and Cobb read it light, and read the debt against it, and the man came away with $1 or 2 or with nothing, carried over. Always carried over. Nobody argued. Arguing cost you the commissary. Arguing cost you the plot. Then he called Turner. Amos brought his cotton up, his whole year in a wagon. Etta stood at the commissary steps with her hands knotted in her apron and her eyes fixed on the beam. Cobb settled the load, and his thumb drifted toward the beam the way it always did, and he opened his mouth to call the weight. 204 pounds. The yard went still. It was Jonah who'd said it. He'd come up out of the crowd, hat in his hand, field clothes on his back. And he'd said the number quiet and plain before Cobb's thumb ever touched the iron. And he laid a folded seed catalog open on the scale platform, the margins black with figures. 204, he said again. That's what Amos Turner's cotton weighs, not 160. I read the beam. I've read it every morning for 2 weeks. He looked up at Cobb. The hand can cipher, Mr. Cobb. You said it yourself. That's why you're running him off. For a second, Cobb only stared. Then the color came up in his face and he laughed. Hard. Ugly. You hear this? The straw hat Yankees found his voice on his way off my land. Boys, put him. Ezra Merrick planted those pecans by Panther Branch. Jonah didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. The name did it. Grafted them himself, 3 of them, the year the creek jumped its bank. He built the first cabin on this place with his own hands, and he named the branch for the cat that took his hound. You know that, Cobb, because you worked for him. But I know it too. Ask yourself how. The laugh was gone off Cobb's face now. Something had come into it instead. The croppers had gone dead quiet, feeling it before they understood it, the way a herd feels weather. Who are you? Cobb said. It wasn't a question anymore. It was a man watching the floor go out from under him. Jonah reached into his coat. He drew out a folded paper, heavy paper, official, and he opened it slow so every eye could follow, and he laid it flat on the ledger box beside the seed catalog. The deed. The seal on it plain even to men who couldn't read a word. My name's Jonah Merrick, he said. Ezra was my uncle. He left me this place when he died last spring. And a lawyer named Silas Pruitt sent me a letter saying it had lost $6,400 over 2 seasons and I ought to sell it quiet and be done. He let his eyes go around the yard, over the tired faces, and back to Cobb. I didn't sell it. I came down to see where the money went. And I hired on as a hand under my own overseer, and I picked cotton on my own land. And I got weighed 40 pounds light on my own scale, by you, in front of these people. He set his hand flat on the deed. You spent 2 years telling these folks the owner never checks the scale. His voice dropped, and the drop was worse than a shout. I'm the owner. And I checked. Nobody breathed. Then Jonah reached to his shirt, and he took out the last folded thing, the small one. Soft at the creases, and he laid it on the ledger box beside the deed. The note. A child's note, penciled, Worn. And I didn't work it out alone, he said. A girl on this place did the arithmetic you were counting on nobody being able to do. She wrote it down. The light scale, the 2 books, the fire you meant to set tonight. All of it, in pencil, by a hand you'd have run off her plot for reading. He looked at Cobb. You were beaten by a 12-year-old, Cobb. You just didn't know it till now. Cobb moved. He lunged for the ledger box, for the deed, or the note, or the true book inside it, some last grab at the thing that could still be burned, and Jonah stepped between him and it. And for one breath the 2 men stood chest to chest on the platform where Cobb had ruled 200 souls. Riders, somebody said. They came up the yard road at a trot. 2 horses, then a buggy. Sheriff Nolan Reeves, star on his coat, come down from the county seat on a grain broker's wire. And behind him in the buggy a narrow man in a good hat, Silas Pruitt, the very lawyer who'd told Jonah to sell the place unseen, come to find the drifter he'd never met was his own client standing in the dirt in a field hand's clothes. Cobb went very still. Sheriff, Jonah said, easy, not taking his eyes off Cobb. There's an iron box under this ledger stand. Inside it are 2 sets of books. One my overseer showed the bank. One he kept for himself. I'd take it kindly if you'd be the man to open it, so nobody says a Merrick planted what's inside. Reeves stepped up onto the platform. He lifted the box. He opened it there in front of them all, and he took out the 2 books, and he set them side by side on the ledger stand, the clean one and the worn one. And he held the worn one up to the cold morning light and turned the pages. You could hear the pages. That was how quiet it was. 30 families and their children, and not a sound but the sheriff turning pages, and somewhere a mule shifting in its traces. Reeves read. His mouth got tighter with every page. He looked at the clean book, and he looked at the worn one, and he looked at Cobb. And he didn't need Jonah to explain the arithmetic. It was all there in 2 columns. What the cotton weighed. What Cobb called it. 2 years of it. Ransom, the sheriff said, and his voice was heavy. This is your hand. Cobb found his bluster one more time. That land lost money. Ask Pruitt. Ask the bank. Cotton's 10 cents a pound, Sheriff. A man can't. It didn't lose a dime. Jonah said it flat. He picked up his own seed catalog, the 2 weeks of margins. Here's every morning I stood in this yard and read the true weight before your thumb touched the beam. It matches your book, Cobb, your own secret book. The 6,400 you wrote off as a loss is sitting in that iron box as stolen weight, family by family, and I can read you off every name. He set the catalog down beside the 2 ledgers. 3 books now on the stand. They all agreed. You didn't lose the money. You took it. Off these people. A little every load, so no one man could ever feel the whole of it. Reeves looked at the 3 books that all told the same story. Then he took Cobb by the arm. Cobb didn't go easy in his heart, you could see that. But his body had given up before his mouth did. He came down off the platform he'd ruled from. Past the men he'd called light for 2 years, and not one of them said a word to him, which was its own kind of verdict. An old cropper near the front, a man Jonah didn't know, gray, bent, 50 hard years on him, took off his hat as Cobb passed. Not for Cobb, for the thing that had just happened. He held his hat against his chest and watched the overseer led to the sheriff's horse, and he didn't put it back on for a good while. Then Jonah did the thing that mattered more than the arrest. Amos, he said, bring your cotton back up. Amos came, slow, not sure the world had really turned. And Jonah rehung the beam. He set it true with his own 2 hands, checked it level. And he weighed Amos Turner's season honest in front of everyone. 204 pounds, he said. The real number, out loud, in daylight, at 10 cents. He did the sum the way he'd done sums his whole life, fast and sure, and this time he didn't hide it. That's this load. Now we do all of them. 2 seasons. Read back true and paid out of the money that box has been holding for you all along. And they did. It took the rest of the morning. Jonah stood at the scale and the sheriff stood by the box, and Silas Pruitt, the lawyer, sat on the platform edge with the true ledger open on his knees and read the names, one at a time, family by family, what they'd truly grown, what they'd truly been owed, what Cobb had shaded off. And Jonah counted the money out into their hands from the recovered box. Real dollars, more money than most of them had held at one time in their lives. When it came Amos Turner's turn, Pruitt read the carried-over debt first, the number that had climbed for 2 years and never once come down. The commissary meal, the coal, the credit at prices built to trap him. "Struck," Jonah said. "That debt's a lie. It was made out of a light scale and a crooked store. It's gone. Draw a line through it, Mr. Pruitt." Pruitt drew the line. Amos Turner watched a lawyer draw a line through 2 years of debt, and he opened his mouth, and nothing came out. He was a man who'd taken his hat off to the one who robbed him, and now he stood square in the morning with his back straight and his 40 acres of shares secure under his feet, and he couldn't make a single word come. Etta came down off the commissary steps and stood against his side, and he put his arm around her, and he still couldn't speak. He didn't need to. Some accounts settle without words. They went to the commissary after. Jonah walked behind the counter, in his store, on his land, and he took the price board down. The meal at its trap price. The coal. The credit terms that kept men carried over forever. He struck them through, one by one, in front of the families pressed into the little tin-roofed room, and he wrote fair figures beside them. And he said the store would sell honest from that day, or it wouldn't sell at all. Then he opened the debt book to the first page, and he went down it, family by family, drawing the false debt to zero. Every line. He paid the true wages out of the recovered money by his own hand, counting it into palm after palm, and the room that had been silent so long got loud, slow at first, and then all at once, the way a creek sounds when the ice finally goes. He came to Etta last. She stood at the end of the counter with her worn book against her chest. He crouched down the way he had at the bend in the path, so his eyes were level with hers, and he took the folded note out of his shirt where it had ridden 2 weeks against his heart, and he showed it to her. "You know what this is," he said. "It's my note. It's the best-kept book on this whole plantation," he said. "You wrote down the truth when every grown man on the place was too scared to say it. I want to keep it. You mind?" She shook her head. And then, because she was 12, and it had been a very long 2 weeks, she cried. Once. Hard. And got done with it, and wiped her face on her sleeve, and stood up straight the way her father had. The winter went by. Spring came up over the delta. By the time the honeysuckle was out along Panther Branch and the earth turned dark and fresh under the plow, Willow Bend was a different place, and it was different in the small ways that last, not the loud ways that fade. The scale beam hung level. Jonah had a man check it every morning, and the man Jonah had chosen was Amos Turner. Because there was no straighter man on the place, and everybody knew it. The cotton got weighed true. A load was what a load was. The commissary sold at fair figures, and it wasn't Jonah who set them anymore. A committee of croppers did. Men who 2 seasons back had taken their hats off to a thief and now sat at a table and set the price of meal like men with a say in their own lives. It was clumsy. They argued. Jonah let them argue. Arguing, he'd decided, was the healthiest sound a place like that could make. Ransom Cobb went to the county for what he'd done, and the books that convicted him were the very books he'd meant to burn. There was a plain justice in that Jonah thought his uncle Ezra would have liked. And on the porch of the house that had been Ezra's most mornings now, a girl sat on the steps with a book. A real one. A school one. Because Jonah had put her to schooling and paid for it, and would hear no argument about that either. He'd given her work besides. She kept the new ledger. The single, honest ledger. One book now where there'd been 2. Every weight in it true because she was the one who wrote them, and she'd sooner have died than shade a number. 12 years old, keeping the accounts of the place that had tried to keep her poor, and doing it better than the grown man who'd stolen from it for years. The folded note stayed in Jonah's breast pocket. He carried it the way another man might carry a photograph. Now and then his hand would go to it without his meaning it to. He stood at the scale one of those spring mornings and watched the beam hang level in the early light, and he thought about the man who'd sworn the owner would never come down and check it. He said it out loud, once, quiet, flat, to nobody, to the memory of Cobb led off past the men he'd cheated. He counted on the owner never coming down. He watched the beam sit true. He should have counted better. Then he went to work, on his own land, this time as what he was. The cotton would come up. The weight would be honest. And a child who'd once pressed a scrap of paper into a stranger's fist would grow up knowing that the truth, written down plain by somebody brave enough to write it, is heavier than any thumb a man can lay on a scale. If you've been watching this one all the way through, comment the town you're watching from. I'd like to know how far this story traveled.